On the 20th of January, UN forces consolidate positions below Seoul against diminishing red pressure. All along the front, there is a noticeable lack of the usual heavy communist troop concentrations. Belief is expressed that they have retired to regroup their armies, badly mauled in recent weeks by air and artillery strikes. On the 25th of January, after several days of aggressive probing attacks, the UN units below Seoul begin a limited offensive. Homicidal, not geographical, is the intent. By week's end, one UN task force slashes to within 10 miles of Seoul. In the central front, Wonju has been retaken, and Allied soldiers scour the mountains, exacting losses of 10-1 on the enemy. On the 10th of February, the 1st Corps of the 8th Army crosses the Han River as the Reds pull back to Seoul. The 25th Division comes to a halt at the south gates of the city. Kimpo Airfield is recaptured, and the port of Incheon is occupied without the loss of a man. On the central front, the 10th Corps continues its action against stiffening enemy resistance. In less than 3 weeks, the Allies' limited offensive has killed and wounded an estimated 73,000 Chinese. On the 11th of February, the Chinese launched their expected counteroffensive on a 30-mile front in the central mountains. Their troops vainly attempt to drive a wedge through the center of the 8th Army's lines. Armored counterattacks smash north from Wonju, and air and artillery increase their hour-by-hour pounding. Finally, north of Incheon, Allied troops cave in the west flank of the Red Drive. By the 18th of February, the Reds' drive has been spent and broken. UN forces have inflicted 33,000 more casualties on the Chinese. On the 20th of February, the Reds have fallen back along most of the 70-mile front. Their total losses for the month rise to approximately 100,000, while UN forces prepare still another killer offensive in their war of maneuver. During the week of the 22nd to the 29th of January, the United Nations limited offensive moves northward as strong task forces recapture key cities and probe for the enemy's main line of defense. Here, a 25th Division combat team strikes north from positions below Osan to test communist strength and to occupy the many towns reported held by only token enemy units. Troops of the 35th Regimental Combat Team enter battered Osan without opposition. After defense posts are established, they push on toward the first day's objective, a village north of Osan. Here, a soldier cleans and checks his machine gun to avoid the danger of stoppages in the wintry weather. Across a frozen stream, the men continue their advance along the road to SUWON. Other UN units to the east move 12 miles above Wonju, while Kumyangjiang falls to Allied forces in an attack highlighted by a bayonet charge of the Turkish brigade. Naval units bombard Incheon in a diversionary raid. UN planes fly 700 sorties on this day, inflicting high losses against the enemy. Though tanks have not recently been encountered in any large numbers, the troops are well prepared for them. As the task force nears its day's objective, civilians coming from the village are methodically searched for weapons. The refugee problem has eased considerably in comparison with the mass flight of hundreds of thousands from Seoul and other endangered cities in the past month, but there are still those who remain in the combat zones between the two armies, keeping UN soldiers constantly on guard against the danger of communist infiltrators. Task force troops move carefully into the war-scarred town, where they will spend the night on the alert for Red snipers and suicide groups. A South Korean interpreter questions 2 refugees. As the limited offensive goes into its second day, the 25th Division spearhead sweeps across the low hills towards SUWON. The 8th Army, finding little red pressure to contend with, regains hundreds of square miles in the western sector of the front. An enemy strong point is encountered, and artillery is called for. The 155 howitzer is zeroed in. To avoid bypassing red pockets in the hills, the troops leave the roads, searching the countryside and villages. Prisoners are taken, some of the few found in the nearly deserted towns. On the second day of their thrust up the main coastal road to Seoul, the task force enters the outskirts of SUWON, carefully searching every building for concealed Reds. Scattered enemy resistance is quickly cleaned out. Meanwhile, sizable gains are recorded north of Icheon and Kumyangjeong, while the naval shelling of Incheon moves into its second day. The day after Suwon's capture, an armored spearhead leaves the north gate, pushing on towards the Han River. Soon it meets the first strong Red defensive lines, halting 12 miles from Seoul. General Joseph S. Bradley, assistant commander of the 25th Division, inspects his advancing troops. The customary inspection and interrogation of civilians begins at SUWON. Men of the 25th Division rest as reports come in that firm contact has finally been reestablished with major units of the enemy. UN troops, in the second week of their limited offensive, battle northward toward Seoul, continuing to forge ahead over the bitterly contested ground north of SUWON. In the new system of United Nations offense, forced by communist hold or die tactics, Allied forces leave the roads and dig the Reds from their caves and foxholes. Enemy dead litter the ridge. Chinese prisoners, routed out of the hills, are thoroughly searched and administered first aid by soldiers of the 25th Division. The face of an American GI expresses the bitter sadness that comes with war. The captives are then escorted to the rear for further interrogation. Very few Chinese surrender to UN forces, as they are taught to expect swift execution upon capture. When convinced that they will not be killed, they are often eager to give information. A United Nations task force moves up for an assault on an enemy-held ridge north of SUWON as the offensive pushes steadily ahead. Realizing the dangers of over-fatigue, these hardened soldiers have learned to take advantage of every opportunity to rest. Now, well accustomed to the strenuous conditions of battle, the men group together in a well-earned sleep. General Bradley consults with the company commander of the Spearhead Unit, which will attack the communist strongpoint lying across the main road to Seoul. Tank commanders determine Red positions and ready their crews for firing. The attack gets underway with the usual preparatory artillery bombardment. The fighting in this sector has been some of the bitterest of the Korean campaign. Key points change hands repeatedly, and gains are measured in yards. The tanks move up to new positions nearer the ridge and continue to blast away at the communist emplacements. The enemy returns the fire and scores a near miss on one of our tanks. A South Korean 57mm battery adds its firepower to the assault as the bombardment proceeds to soften up the Reds for the infantry attack. A South Korean officer calls for mortar fire, and the mortars lend their explosive voice to the artillery pounding. Paced by this support, the column brings the full force of its firepower to bear on the Red-dominated hill. Throughout Korea during the first week of February, observers are noticing more and more the high morale evidenced by the UN soldiers. With assured faith in their leaders and confidence in their own ability as a fighting team, the troops of 14 nations forge ahead in the push northward toward the Han River and Seoul. On the 10th of February, troops of the 25th Division reached the outskirts of Seoul. The Han River Bridge figures once more in the Korean fighting, and a familiar sign still stands. 3 badly frightened Chinese prisoners are brought in for questioning. Expecting execution, they face only interrogation and removal to PW compounds. Attempting to cross the Han, a patrol is halted temporarily by intense fire from the communists occupying Seoul. Later, another patrol managed to enter the city, but withdrew after some limited probing. As the action continues with opposing forces dueling from opposite sides of the Han, other UN task forces are sweeping north and west to occupy Incheon and Kimpo. At the week's close, 4 Allied divisions are at the Han, and Seoul is nearly surrounded. As the United Nations offensive goes into its 3rd week, the communist defense becomes more stubborn and fanatical. Enemy troops give ground slowly along most of the front in the face of spirited Allied attacks. Here in the central sector north of Incheon, 24th Division troops recapture Hill 704, which was taken from them by a Red assault on the previous night. A prisoner points out nearby Chinese positions. The big guns of the U.S. tanks are prepared for action, and having pinpointed enemy concentrations on the adjacent hills, bring their massed firepower to bear on the stubbornly resisting Reds entrenched on the slopes. In constant communication with the fire control center, the tanks continue their heavy bombardment. The enemy is blasted relentlessly in preparation for the following infantry attack. Above Wonju, a flying boxcar delivers ammunition and supplies to the 10th Corps, which is preparing a new assault against increasing Red pressure in the central mountain sector. Supply by airdrop, once an emergency measure, has become routine in Korea. With the spring thaws due soon, and with them the almost impassable Korean mud, these techniques of airborne logistical support will permit continued supply operations. North of Incheon, 24th Division Artillery prepares to open fire on Hill 584, where UN forces are attempting to dislodge a stubborn enemy force. These hill positions anchor the right flank of the Red Central Sector offensive. By commanding the heights, UN troops hope to flank and cave in the communist advance. 4.2 heavy mortars join in the barrage. The communists held fast in these hills during most of the Allied limited offensive of the last 3 weeks. Now, with the launching of the Reds' counteroffensive down the central mountains, the communists cling tenaciously to this strong hill salient, which guards the right flank of their drive toward Wonju. Observers watch strikes on the enemy hill positions. Under cover of the barrage, the men push up the steep terrain towards the objective. Protected by the thick and tangled underbrush, the Reds laid down a volume of small arms fire that causes the troops to slow down in their advance. During the last 10 days, key points in this hill area have repeatedly changed hands, with Allied gains being held down to a few thousand yards. The troops keep watch for snipers, plotting the course to be followed when the assault is resumed. Meanwhile, machine gun positions are set up as they consolidate their gains against a possible Red counter-thrust. The communist lines are strong, and artillery fire is called for to loosen enemy supporting areas. In spite of the initial bombardment, the Reds hold firm in their emplaced positions, dominating the heights. The howitzer shells smash lethal punches into the face of the enemy. The steep grade slows the advance. Attacking in battalion strength, the troops move up as fast as possible to avoid Red sniper fire. Red forces have relied heavily on surprise night attacks, attempting to regain positions taken from them during the day by UN units. The communist tactics of infiltration and sudden mass charges fit well with the dense foliage. Supporting fire is supplied by heavy machine guns. The attack gets underway. The new assault carries forward to one section of the hill's crest where UN troops are able to bring fire directly on the main enemy positions in close, rugged fighting. The attack is turned back. However, at week's end, an all-out drive crushes these positions, collapsing the right flank of the Reds' offensive. By the 18th of February, UN forces seize the initiative again as Operation Killer forges northward in the wake of the ill-fated Red breakthrough attempt.